What's up YouTube, Dow here from Zeph War Games, and well, ultimately that ban list was pretty... So it wasn't the greatest. I thought I would do an updated tier list. Now I'm only going to do a very mini tier list. I'm only going to put the top 10 decks that I feel are going to be in the format come the ban list introduction, which it goes in effect of the 1st of December. Now, if you haven't seen the ban list predictions already or the ban list, by all means check them out. I put just the images up. I'm not going to do a ban list video because everyone and their mum does them and they do get a little bit boring. So what we're going to do in this is I do have a host of decks in front of you, as you can see, but we're going to take you through what I feel is going to be the new top 10 decks. Some haven't changed, some will change, and we'll kind of go from there. So we'll start off with the main deck right now, and that is Yugioh tier or tier elements, however you want to kind of spin it. I feel that they're still going to be the best deck. Now, the reason I say that is because when you look at the ban list, Mystic Mine has gone, it was more of a counteraction to tiers. They've lost Herald of Arclight, or Herald of Arclight goes to 1. Again, not a massive change for them. They can still play and do everything they need to. The biggest introduction that changes for tier elements is decks that will be able to now play free macro and free defissure. But again, there's not a lot of decks out there that can actually effectively use them apart from its nearest contender, and that is of course Flunderies. Now Flunderies I'm also going to put up as the best deck because it is the only real deck right now, this moment, before we get the new Kashtira support in February, that will stand a chance against tier elements, and it can play free macro, free Cosmo. So it can play the deck, or it can play the new Floodgates or the returning Floodgates that will pretty much out every deck in the meta. The fact that it has a wind barrier statue, so it's got a control special summon lock, it's got protection from being destroyed, it could already play triple D shifter, it can now play free macro Cosmo, free D fissure. Like, this deck is absolutely mental. The only thing it will lose to is it will lose to itself because it will brick on times, but even then they now have even more chance of turning out to a floodgate that if they go first and they open up no birds, they can still just go, okay, well, set defissure, activate defissure, set macro, pass, activate macro. You now need to, as a tier element player or any type of player, deal with that back row before you can start using your graveyard. So I'm not saying that these are both tier 0. I just feel that both of these decks are on now even level playing field. Like, we've seen it happen. Floateries were being utilized the most at the most recent YCSs, and I can't see them changing. They've probably been the only ones that have got stronger thanks to this ban list. Moving in to tier 1, we are going to put the sprites. I still think sprites are really, really good. The best thing about sprites is technically they can still play. They can play D-Shifter in their side deck. They could main deck, and they could go for a complete banish version with macros and D-Fissures. And the reason they can do that is technically the only thing they'll lose would be sprite smashers. And they can ultimately get rid of that as well. Yes, Elf won't be as effective because it won't be able to keep bringing stuff back from the graveyard, but if you were to play free macro, you can pretty much set up your Elf anyway, set up your Toad plays, everything you need to, and then flip a macro. So you've already built your board, presented your board, and done everything you need to. Another deck that we saw a lot of at the YCSs, and that's going to be Madolche. Again, Madolche actually thrive on having no graveyard. This was a deck that could already use Dimensional Shifter. They can technically, if they wanted to, use Macro Cosmo and D-Fissure, because apart from, like, yes, okay, all their stuff will shuffle themselves back into the graveyard, which they would no longer have access to. It still gives their graveyard a clear space. Now, it's a bit of give and take. I'm not saying that this is 4th, as it is currently being labelled onto this list, but I do feel that it is one that deserves an honourable mention, and I feel that it's only got stronger. With the fact that it's got non-target shuffle, it's got its own searchable trap card negate, and it can utilise all of the banish cards if it wanted to, is going to make it incredibly powerful and very, very tricky to deal with. Moving on to the other decks, I still feel can compete in this format, but will now struggle with triple Cosmo, macro Cosmo and everything like that. I still think Rika plants are incredibly powerful. The fact that they contribute as cost to not trigger all of the tier elements effects. I feel the issue is that with the Yugioh cards, there's cards that in the graveyard they can start triggering effects and do what they need to do. Again, I don't feel that this is in 4th place or anything like that. I still feel that it is incredibly powerful, but it's a deck that will get hurt with the additional representations of macro and everything else. Another deck that I feel deserves an honourable mention and is probably higher up on the list than, of course, Madolches and the Rika Plants is Exo Sisters. Now, we saw Exo Sisters get utilised at YCS. Yes, they did use Mystic Mine on some of the accounts, but they could also, again, it's another deck that doesn't really worry too much about macro, defissure, and of course Dimension Shifter as well. Yes, it would be nice for them to have their graveyard, but they really don't mind if they've got the ability to push for an OTK, as well as already having monsters or cards on the board that will allow them to banish cards. The backup of a macro and a defissure is going to be just as strong to kind of deal with it as well. We're then going to look at, again, honorable mention decks. They aren't really going to be able to thrive. Like, this ban list has really changed a lot. So something to look forward to in the future, I suppose, if you really don't want to be playing tier elements, is, I believe, Kashtira right now, a tier 2. Even that, they might even be sleepers than anything else because they really can't compete to the level they want to. They now can still play free macro and free defissure, and they really do not care about that, which is great for the deck. But when they get the new support in February of 2023, they will go from sleepers, in my opinion, straight up to tier 1, if not one of the best decks alongside Flunderees. The one thing that they do have on the edge of Flunderees is technically they can normal summon any of their level 7s if they do have the Kashtira spell. They can also special summon Unicorn because it is a wind, so they don't really worry too much about the lock. And then just by getting those 2 level 7s, they can go into Blafnia, but they can go into the Phantom Knights of Dracosac. Not Phantom Knights. God, I'll get there eventually. They can go into Dracosac, and that will then allow them to start picking off bits of the board, as well as Unicorn being able to banish the extra deck, which is a little bit less relevant. But the fact that you could technically go Unicorn, search out the spell, normal summon Fenrir. Fenrir declares an attack, banish something, banish that barrier statue if you want to, attack with the Unicorn. Now, obviously, the biggest issues are if they do have the M-Pen on the board as well, is all of these cards are going to need to be specialed in defense, and that's where Draco Sack comes into play, because then you can overlay the 2 level 7s, go into Draco Sack, detach, pop the M-Pen, pop the statue, and continue to make your plays as well. Not to mention that if you are able to get additional monsters on the board after that point, because it's been able to pop and not go into the battle phase, ultimately, all you need to do is get an XYZ on the board, and you can make Zeus and just clear board and go from there. So that's another card that doesn't really rely heavily on the graveyard, but can still do incredibly a lot of damage as well. Then another one we're going to look at, and again, I kind of want to put it into tier 1, but it is probably more tier 2. And that's obviously Branded. I still feel Branded have great power and representation in this format. However, the biggest issue that they now face is, again, with macros and defissures and everything else like that running around in the format to deal with tier elements and attribute locks in the form of the Wind Barrier statue for Flunderees. The deck really cannot, attempt to kind of build as much as it wants to, and I really do feel that it will struggle. Now, the reason that I've mentioned Brandon as kind of like an honourable mention is because it can be used as an alternative engine, but what it does work well with is, of course, buy-steals. Now, the buy-steals I'm going to put at 1.5, whether you count that as an engine, whether you count that as buy-steal Thunder Dragon, buy-steal Dragon Link, something like that. The buy-steal Thunder Dragons actually get massive advantage if they wanted to play something like Dimensional Fissure, Macrocosmo, or if they're facing against it. On top of that as well, it does have a great matchup against the tier element deck. However, it will struggle against the Flunderees. They really cannot deal with a Wind Barrier statue. That will be a big issue. And then if a Sprite deck was to go complete anti-meta and play the stuff like macros, defissures, shifters, everything like that, again, the buy-steals will start to suffer because they really need their graveyard in order to tick over and keep on pushing. Another deck that I want to be putting here is tier 2, but I also feel that it could pretty much fall in the tier 1.5 category, is, of course, the Fish or the Gotties. Now, the reason that I've put this in here, again, I'm not really saying that it's in the top 10. It could be around about that 9th and 8th place. But again, it's just a deck that benefits from this ban list. It can utilize Defissure, it can utilize Macrocosmo, and then they can all bring themselves back, make big synchro monsters, make pop-in synchro monsters, and it really does give them utility in order to push a little bit further forward. So it's one of these decks that has kind of benefited more so from this ban list than anyone else. And then when you look at the other cards that I've got down below here, Punks are pretty much dead. Salamangreats kind of want their graveyard. They can't rely on macro or anything like that. Virtual World don't completely lose out with macro and defissure, but again with the level 6 that they want to kind of keep bringing back from the graveyard, again it does hurt them in a really bad way. The same for stuff like Tri Brigade, Synchrons, everything like that. When you look at what they want and what they need in their graveyard, the same with Crystal Beast, Conclave Control, DDDs, even Dinos, they all want their graveyard, and this ban list has kind of said, you know what, our way of dealing with tier elements is to give you more cards to get rid of the graveyard. But it didn't really stop to think and go, well, hang on a minute. Getting rid of the graveyard isn't the greatest thing, because the only deck that will benefit massively from that are the decks that are already at the top in the form of Flunderees and, of course, Sprites the most. The only decks that have got an additional bump that have made them move up a tier, that was a deck you may not have considered or may want to be looking into because they'll be a lot cheaper, is the stuff like the Gottis, possibly even Madolches as well. So that's pretty much the list of kind of what I've gone for. I've talked to you about the other ones down below. Apart from other decks, it will just be pure anti-meta now. So stuff like, if you really wanted to, S-Forces could play. You look at decks that could play triple D-Fissure, triple Macro, and triple D-Shifter and not care about it. They are ones to do it. In theory, if Mystic Mine was still around, you could play Mystic Mine with all of those, which would be absolutely horrifying, and I wouldn't want to go anywhere near it. But everything else still relies on its graveyard. Invoked, graveyard. Scareclaws, technically they still want their graveyard. Sky Strikers, they still want their graveyard. Ray is still one of the most powerful and important cards they have. Sword Souls, they want the graveyard. Tenyis, if they wanted to go to Bicycle Route, they need to. They could, if they wanted to, cut some of them out, but then again, you lose the Long One Burn, you'll lose your Mo You Draw. It is just completely painful towards it. Another deck that I haven't put on here but that deserves an honourable mention is something like Tellarknights. Now obviously Tellarknights got Patellamaias back, which is absolutely amazing. They do have an ability to turn skip, but it's just not the powerhouse it once was. It's still very good, and it does benefit from the change of the ban list. But Patellamaias, as it was before, was always more of an abusable card for other decks that could spam out level 4s, tier elements, than it was anything else. I mean, at the end of the day, the tier elements have the ability, if they really wanted to. You've got Chiron, Mud Dragon, and Rhino Heart. All of those could go into a Patellamaias. You could detach all of those, go into a Nova, and then turn Nova into Infinity. As if the deck needed another route, but I don't really see where Patellamaias fits into this in order to disrupt the main meta. Like, Sprites aren't going to make it, Flunderees aren't going to make it. It's kind of one of these cards, or this ban list kind of says to me, these are cards we forgot to put on the last list, or because we'd already decided to print Herald of the Orange Light as a super rare, we didn't want to put this because we wanted to sell the OTS, or we wanted to make OTS 20 as appealing as anything. So it's a very difficult list to kind of take in and say, yeah, okay, cool, we're good to rock and roll with this. It's something that basically doesn't look like an emergency ban list because it doesn't fix anything, but doesn't look like they've tried to fix any of the issues in the meta right now, because they still want reprint value, future support value, and just the general decks. They've gone, well, what's the way that we can bring back old cards that helps you deal with the current meta right now? And they've gone, well, take away their graveyard. Not always the best for the game. Anyway, so that's just my little short, sweet, simple breakdown. So Kashtira, definitely something to be looking into now. Fenris have started to slowly drop. Now, I've seen people, what I mean by that is I've seen people trying to sell them for £35 to £40. I know it's not as big of a drop as it was before. Maybe they're going to go back up because of this ban list that actually makes them stronger come February. But if it's something where you're like, you know what, I'm going to sit this format out. I've got Christmas, so I'm going to save my money, save my time for that one. We even get Dark World decks next week, and they've not really benefited. Like, if anything, this ban list has actually deterred them even more, because it's like, well, everyone's now going to be playing macros and D-Fissures. My Dark Worlds are never going to hit the graveyard. So that's a bit of a big disappointment as well. But it'll be something that we see to come into effect as of the 1st of December. So like I said, if you don't mind taking the Christmas break off and come back in February, once we get the new set, you'll start to see Kashtira start to climb up the ladder. And Kashtira probably look like more of a deck that is future proof, and what I mean by that is I can't imagine they're going to get any type of change coming to them until at least after February, once the set has been sold. And then even the first ban list of 2023, I can't imagine that they'll hit the Kashtiras. They might hit the macros and the D-Fissures down, but the Kashtiras will still be incredibly powerful at that point as well. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, the whole 9 yards. Till next time, as absolutely always, guys, stay safe, and of course, happy dueling!